Hello, and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite Size Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. This week we'll be talking about a somewhat new and not very talked about attack vector that was recently found to have led to the compromise of over 70,000 domains. It's called the Sitting Duck attack, and it was initially discovered in 2018. It allows attackers to basically hijack domains owned by other people, and it's surprisingly easy to do if there's a basic misconfiguration. First, the registered domain needs to use or delegate authoritative DNS to a provider, which is not the registrar. Basically, if I have a web domain, I may have registered it with a company called Namecheap, but I may decide to use a different hosting provider that isn't Namecheap to actually host my website and to have the up-to-date domain name services information. DNS, or Domain Name Services, is a service that allows you to type in a website like Amazon.com instead of having to memorize the IP address of Amazon.com, because humans are really good at knowing names, and not very good at knowing a series of numbers, but for computers it's the opposite. Computers do a lot better with numbers and not as well with names, so it's useful to have DNS to do that translation for us. But DNS can have other types of records as well, such as mail records or just basic text records. Text records are often used if you need to verify your domain. I tend to use this when I'm setting up something like federated identity. If I want to use the sign in with Google thing, Google needs to know that I actually own my website. So Google will ask me to put in a text record so that they can verify that I'm able to edit my DNS records. I put in the text records, Google verifies it, all is good. And now I'm allowed to have that sign in with Google button on my website. Editing DNS records is going to come up later, but first we need another condition to make this Sitting Duck attack work. Next, we need for the provider that is giving us the authoritative domain name services to be unable to resolve queries itself, due to not having information about the domain, which in our example is what the original domain registrar would have. I registered it with Namecheap. That should be the authoritative domain name server, but I'm hosting it with someone else and using a different DNS service that's not authoritative. You can still look up my website and find it, but DNS won't be asking Namecheap about the location of my server, it'll be asking my hosting provider. This creates a disconnect. Finally, the DNS provider needs to allow you to claim a domain without verifying that you actually own it. This may seem like something that should happen, but you would be surprised. The Sitting Duck setup is basically one giant misconfiguration. That means you can claim a domain, and the authoritative DNS server, which, being authoritative, has precedence over other DNS servers and in fact informs those DNS servers of who owns what, can't actually say, hey, you don't really own this. It's an inconsistency with the records of who owns what, and, well, I think you may know where this is heading. All an attacker has to do is claim the domain using a DNS provider by setting up their very own DNS records, basically saying they own the domain. This is entirely without access to the account owner of the website. No passwords need to be compromised, no phishing attempts need to be made. It's actually really easy for the attacker to do, which makes it such a dangerous attack. This is also dangerous because it's a really stealthy attack. If the website owner isn't paying attention, they probably won't even notice, and the only change that anyone would see is the IP address of the website. And really, that's not such an unusual thing to have change. IP can change all the time, especially if a website is expanding and more servers need to be used to keep up with the increased demand. And even more so if this website is hosted using some kind of cloud infrastructure. If you were trying to discover Sitting Duck websites that had been hijacked, tracking based on IP changes would mostly just get a lot of false positives. However, the most important thing by far to threat actors is the reputation of the websites they take over. Domains and IP addresses can have good and bad reputations, and I'm sure you can figure this out. Domains with bad reputations can be blocked automatically and often include websites with malicious activity that people have observed. Think of websites that are hosting scams or malware, or that host websites you get sent in phishing emails. You can't really use these domains for very long because eventually it will be blocked by so many web browsers, antivirus software, endpoint protection software, that essentially no one visits it anymore, even if you entirely change the appearance. And it just won't populate in search results either. If you can't get people to your malicious website, you can't infect them with malware or steal their credentials or do anything else really. On the other hand, a domain with a good reputation is the opposite. Think of Amazon.com. You know that website. You probably visit it regularly to find some stuff to buy. You trust it. There may be some shops themselves that are sketchy or illegitimate, but Amazon.com itself doesn't have any malware, and it hasn't been used specifically to set up scams. Now imagine if someone hijacked the domain. The website still looks the same, but it's now under control of hackers. They can use Amazon servers for many different things. Their email servers can send spam and phishing emails. They can use the site to deploy malware. They can establish command and control servers to control botnets for DDoS attacks. It's going to take longer for a domain with a good reputation to be flagged as malicious, because, well, people know it as a safe website. And, well, currently Amazon's fine. They haven't been hijacked. But over 70,000 websites have. Sites that host entertainment companies, law firms, cosmetic suppliers, tire sales firms, online clothing stores, even an IPTV service provider, who you would really hope would be keeping their DNS records up to date. This kind of attack mostly targets smaller businesses without a very large technical staff. It may only be staffed by one IT guy who sort of knows what they're doing, or one IT guy that stepped in after a different IT guy quit and doesn't fully understand how the website is configured and may not even realize their DNS records are not straight. Unfortunately, as an ordinary person, you can't do a ton if a domain is hijacked. But also fortunately, you're not as likely to just get malware immediately upon visiting a hijacked site. That would be too obvious and get them shut down way too easily, and waste the good reputation website they tried to hijack. Usually, you're going to just see phishing and scam emails, so the usual advice applies. When you get an email that tells you to click on a link or immediately take some sort of action, stop, don't do it, and think about it for a bit. Look for misspellings. Hover over the link and see if it takes you somewhere it's not supposed to. And if it involves going to a portal to log onto your account, just open a new tab and navigate to the site without clicking the link. And think, is this something reasonable that this website would normally ask me to do? Due to their very nature, sitting ducks are virtually impossible to spot. However, if you're a website owner, validate that your hosting provider and DNS providers are on the same page, so that not anyone can just waltz in and claim to be you. This is a rather complicated subject to explain, so for more information, please read my sources linked in the description. Speaking of which, thank you to Infoblox for doing a really comprehensive coverage of sitting duck attacks. As well as thank you to InfoSecurity Magazine, The Hacker News, Cyber News, and Tech Target for also reporting on this attack. And of course, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime, and until next time, stay secure.